At 6 years old, Frida Kahlo contracted polio. It left her right leg thinner, weaker, a difference she covered with long skirts, but never let define her spirit. The illness kept her bedridden for months, isolated from other children. But during that quiet, painful time, she grew closer to her father. He encouraged her to stay active, to ride bikes, to sharpen her mind. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida didn't dream of being a wife. She wanted to be a doctor. At 15, she enrolled in Mexico City's prestigious National Preparatory School, one of the only girls accepted. There, she stood out, for her wit, her radical mind, and her unapologetic style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as Los Cachuchas, students who debated art, literature, politics, and revolution. But even before her body was shattered, and before her name became a legend, Frida was already carving herself into the world with defiance and vision. She wasn't just growing up, she was reconstructing herself. On September 17, 1925, her life split in two, the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, Frida boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend Alejandro. They were laughing, teasing, arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. Then, impact. A streetcar collided with the bus, crushing it against a wall. Wood splintered. Bodies flew. Frida was impaled by a metal handrail. It entered through her hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spine fractured in 3 places. Her right leg shattered. Her foot dislocated. Her collarbone, ribs, and shoulder broke. Her abdomen was pierced. She was only 18. A man covered her with an overcoat. Someone noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from gold dust. It had spilled from a pouch she carried, and now coated her wounds in glittering ash. She was rushed to the Red Cross hospital. Dozens of surgeries followed. She lay in a full body cast, fighting infection and uncertainty. Her dream of becoming a doctor faded more each day. But something else stirred. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother built a custom easel above her bed. A mirror hung from the canopy so she could see herself, lying flat, broken. Frida began to paint, first out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subject, herself, not from vanity, from necessity. She once said, "I paint myself because I am so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." The crash had destroyed her body, but it opened a door, into her mind, into her pain, into a surreal visual language that would become her signature. The girl who once wanted to heal others was now learning to heal herself, one brushstroke at a time. Encased in plaster and steel, breathless with pain, Frida found a voice louder than words. Her art became a language, deeply personal, brutally honest, sometimes hard to look at, which was exactly the point. Frida didn't paint flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain. Her pain, physical, emotional, existential. Her early works were small, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional images of miracles and suffering. Frida turned that tradition inward. Her body became the altar, her emotions, the offering. She painted herself as pierced, as split, as bleeding. In one painting, she's impaled by nails, a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats through a barren landscape, tethered to a fractured column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, broken, bleeding, decapitated, but never passive, always watching. Her pain was never sanitized. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each brushstroke reclaimed her body, her truth, her identity as a woman in a world that constantly tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story. she was inventing a new one. A visual language that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and myth. Her canvases became dreamlike autopsies of the soul, framed in pain, culture, and clarity. By the time she could walk again, slowly, painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint pain. She made the world look at it. And in doing so, she turned suffering into sacred self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and just 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most profound and turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior, Mexico's most famous painter, physically massive, politically influential, artistically undeniable. Frida had admired his murals from afar, but now she wanted his opinion. She brought her paintings to the Ministry of Education, interrupted his scaffolded work, and asked him bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego looked once and said, "Yes," and not out of kindness. He recognized something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and electric, full of pain, irony, beauty, and truth. Their relationship began soon after, intense, consuming, creative, and chaotic. Frida once said, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929, an unlikely match. He, enormous, infamous, politically famous. She, small, sharp-tongued, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate, but far from peaceful. Diego supported her art, he encouraged her, he believed in her genius, but he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated, and in return, she took lovers of her own, both men and women. Among them, reportedly, Leon Trotsky and Georgia O'Keeffe. In 1939, they divorced. 1 year later, they remarried, but this time, on different terms. Frida kept her home, her money, and her name. The second marriage was less about romantic love and more about mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals, despite the pain, Diego remained a constant force in her life. He challenged her, he wounded her, but he also believed in her, not just as a painter, but as a revolutionary redefining what art could be. Together, they were not harmonious, but they were legendary. In the 1930s, Frida followed Diego through the United States, San Francisco, Detroit, New York, while he painted murals. She painted herself. Her years abroad brought Frida Kahlo face to face with American industrialism, vast wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism. She was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and a fierce admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially during the Great Depression, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked what she saw as a culture obsessed with appearance and drowning in materialism. She missed the color, the contradiction, the spirit of Mexico. While Diego painted towering murals on factory walls, Frida turned inward. She painted quieter revolutions on tin and canvas, personal, sharp, symbolic. Her style solidified, surreal yet intimate, emotional, defiant, and deeply Mexican. With every brushstroke, her body, fractured and healing, became a landscape of resistance. Multiple surgeries, physical pain, a failed pregnancy in Detroit, all of it poured into her work. Her portraits showed her bleeding, dissected, exposed, and yet, Her gaze never flinched. Calm, director, unapologetic. In Henry Ford Hospital, she lies on a bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols, a fetus, a snail, medical instruments, a broken pelvis. The canvas bleeds truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home during his exile. She wore Tijuana dresses, not for style, but as a statement, cultural, political, personal. Her art was inseparable from her beliefs. Her body, her identity, and her ideology were all one. While Diego painted revolutions on walls, Frida painted their cost. The body in fragments, the mind aflame, the soul staring back. In exile and in illness, she became more than a painter of pain. She became a painter of resistance. When Frida returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely, a force. Her art pulsed with raw truth, surreal symbolism, and deep cultural identity. Back in Casa Azul, she reclaimed herself. The house in Coyoacan was a sanctuary. Cobalt blue walls, yellow accents, Aztec statues in the garden, parrots, monkeys, color, contradiction. Her home became a living expression of her imagination, a blend of elegance and earth, tradition and rebellion. She surrounded herself with pre-Columbian relics, ex-votos, folk art, revolutionary books. She wore bright Tijuana dresses, adorned her hair with flowers, painted amid the scent of copal as mariachi music drifted in from the street. This period marked an eruption of creativity. Her works became more intricate, more symbolic, more politically charged. The two Fridas portrayed a divided self, one in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in traditional clothing, composed and strong. A visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris. Artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her originality. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to claim her, she pushed back. "They thought I was a surrealist," she said. "But I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality." She painted Mexico, not the romantic version, but the real one, alive, raw, complicated. Her work overflowed with symbolism, skeletons, hummingbirds, thorns, corn, blood. She honored her indigenous roots, while exposing the violence of the past and the present. But even as her voice as an artist grew stronger, her body continued to collapse. Surgery after surgery, chronic pain, infections. Still, she painted, propped up in bed, torso wrapped in corsets, fingers clenched around a brush. She had returned to Mexico not to rest, but to reclaim her power. Through paint, through politics, through the fearless embrace of self. Her spine was crumbling, her right leg endlessly infected. Over her lifetime, Frida Kahlo endured more than 30 surgeries, often one after another, brutal, unrelenting. She spent months encased in full body casts, immobilized in traction devices that stretched her bones apart, piece by piece. But still, she painted. Each canvas became a scream, a prayer, a rebellion. Her works grew darker, more precise, more fearless. She no longer hid behind metaphor. She painted pain as it was. In the broken column, she paints herself torn down the middle. Nails pierce her skin, her spine replaced by a crumbling ionic column. Her face, stoic, her gaze, unflinching. Pain was no longer a subject. It was her companion, her antagonist, and always her muse. Her political voice, too, grew sharper. She rejoined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in protests, wrote fiery letters. When her body could no longer walk, she rolled into protests in a wheelchair, holding signs, shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was finally given her first solo exhibition in Mexico. Doctors said she was too ill to attend, so she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed, dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her work, greeting guests with tequila, laughter, and eyes still on fire. Her final paintings were childlike and terrifying. In Marxism, Will Give Health to the Sick, she paints herself in a steel corset, held by Marx's hands, casting away the symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons. One piece bore the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even in death's shadow, Frida remained defiant, joyful, political. Her final self-portraits weren't just art, they were acts of revolution. On July 13, 1954, at just 47 years old, Frida Kahlo died in the same place she was born, La Casa Azul, in Coyoacán. The official cause, a pulmonary embolism. But those closest to her whispered something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted. Exhausted by pain, by surgeries, by the endless war against her own body. Just days before, she had joined a protest against the CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. Frail, in a wheelchair, fist raised in the air. Her final heartbeat was still revolution. Her last diary entry was simple and unforgettable. I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. Her funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural sanctuary. Her body was draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, watched over by artists, friends, revolutionaries, and Diego Rivera. He was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of my life, even though his betrayals had nearly destroyed her. And yet, something extraordinary happened after her death. Frida refused to disappear. At first, her name lived only in art circles. Her work was hard to categorize, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her story began to resonate. Through the 1970s and 80s, feminist scholars and activists reclaimed her voice. Frida was no longer just a painter. She became a symbol of pain turned to beauty, of feminism through resistance, of unapologetic Mexican identity, of queerness, disability, and revolution. Her face, the unibrow, the flowers, the gaze, became iconic. And La Casa Azul became a museum. Diary became a sacred text. Her paintings now hang in the greatest museums in the world. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow. But in death, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind art. She left behind a mirror and dared us to look. Not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, her face is everywhere. Printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, icons. Her unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her unwavering gaze, instantly recognizable. But what gives her legacy power isn't that we recognize her image. It's that we recognize the truth behind it. Frida didn't try to be flawless. She never fit into boxes, and never cared to. In a world obsessed with perfection, she gave us realness. Raw, messy, brilliant, angry, joyful, contradictory. She celebrated her differences, her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned them into art that transcended borders and decades. She became more than an artist. She became a symbol, a global icon of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she's a fearless bisexual icon, who lived openly in a time that demanded silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't ask permission. For disabled artists, she's proof that pain can hold the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she is a daughter reclaimed, fierce, folkloric, and forever part of the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange, too personal, are now revered. Works like the two Fridas, Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, The Broken Column. These aren't just seen, they're felt by anyone who has ever suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. Frida lived in the margins and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradiction, a communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who loved again, a body in pieces with a soul unbreakable. And through it all, she painted, not just with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. And in doing so, she told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art before. Now, when we see her face, we see courage, we see color, we see resistance, we see Frida, not gone, but immortal. Hey friends, tonight we'll be exploring something a bit darker, an age of plagues, punishments, and a food called pottage that you'll wish you never heard of. We're taking a slow dive into what daily life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles. Forget the romantic nights and grand feasts that Hollywood loves to sell you. The truth? You probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see where in the world this sleepy little community gathers from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a little ambient hum, and let's drift back together. Congratulations, you've just awakened in the year 1325. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Your bed is a rotting pile of straw, crawling with bugs, and packed into a burlap sack that smells like a barn floor. Because, well, 3 months ago, it was a barn floor. No memory foam, no pillows, and certainly no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a coarse wool blanket that hasn't seen soap since last winter, and now weighs about as much as a small cow from layers of grime. You blink and wince as a church bell tolls in the distance. It's your alarm clock, medieval edition, louder, harsher, and utterly unforgiving. You live in a small wooden hut, one room, no windows, and a charming open-concept layout where your entire family, livestock, and whatever insects have taken up residence all cohabitate. The smell is complex, a mix of stale ale, sweaty bodies, goats, and something you really hope isn't mold. But you know, deep down, it probably is. Scented candles don't exist, and even if they did, they'd just melt into your dirt floor. You stretch, immediately regret it. The air is freezing, and your joints creak like an old wooden door. You're 22 years old, which, in medieval terms, is basically middle-aged. Your spine pops. Your knees sound like rocks being shaken in a cloth bag. The floor is wet, from last night's rain dripping through your thatched roof. Or crusty, from whatever your neighbor's chicken did while you slept. Either way, your feet are part of the ecosystem now. And privacy? What's that? Your whole family, and maybe a cousin who overstayed their welcome, is waking up beside you. There are no bedrooms, no curtains, no me time, just community, constant, unavoidable community. Welcome to a medieval morning. you are never truly alone, because the rodents, the fleas, and the 8 other people in your hut are always nearby. Somehow, you've pulled yourself out of that medieval straw pile. Congratulations, but now, nature calls, and it's not calling gently, it's screaming. Time to say goodbye to modern luxuries. There's no toilet, no seat, no flush, no roll of toilet paper, not even a grumpy plunger watching from the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an experience, a messy one, a public one, and somehow still a group activity. If you're a peasant, your toilet is probably a wooden bucket behind the house, and it's already full, because Uncle Wolfstan had a rough night, thanks to those bad turnips. The smell? It's biblical. You hold your breath, finish your business, and then, the grand finale, toss it into the street. Yes, the street. You're supposed to shout something like, "Gardez-le," Old French for "watch out below." But honestly, no one reacts fast enough, because streets in medieval towns are open sewers, a free-flowing cocktail of human waste, animal droppings, and liquids of unknown origin you'd really rather not investigate. If your town is lucky enough to have public latrines, congratulations. You now get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is a myth and airflow is a cruel joke. Try not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper? Never heard of it. Most folks wipe with straw, moss, rags, or, if they're really treating themselves, a scrap of wool. Sometimes, nothing at all, which might explain why handshakes weren't all that popular yet. And if you're lucky enough to live in a castle, surely things are better, right? Well, sort of. You might have something called a garderobe, basically a hole in the wall that drops your waist straight into the moat. Great idea, until your enemies figure it out. Because yes, sometimes attackers climbed in through the waist chute. Talk about a surprise entrance. So whether you're a peasant or a noble, medieval bathroom time is more of a humiliation ritual. It's cold, it's public, it's risky, and it's never, ever clean. One slip on a wet stone path, and you're face first in humanity's leftovers. And we haven't even talked about brushing your teeth yet. But don't worry, that's coming up next. You survived the bathroom. That alone should earn you a reward. Maybe a warm breakfast? Something cozy? Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Comfort isn't part of the package. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is more of a survival task. No eggs Benedict, no coffee machine gurgling to life, no toast, and definitely no avocado. You squat near the hearth and stare into a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off someone's boot. Welcome to your daily dose of pottage, a thick, mushy stew made from whatever was lying around. Grains, root vegetables, maybe a bean or two if the stars aligned. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks. New ingredients just get dumped on top of the old ones. Less of a recipe, more of an ongoing experiment in edible persistence. Alongside it, a chunk of bread so dense it could block arrows, made from coarse rye or barley, often mixed with sawdust, acorns, or whatever else was available. Wheat? That's fantasy food for rich folks. This loaf? It's not your friend. You don't slice it. You negotiate with it. And what about drinks? Forget orange juice or oat milk lattes. You're drinking beer. Yes, at 6 in the morning. Because the water, it's basically a microbial zoo. So, you start your day with a weak ale. Low alcohol, high survivability. Even children drink it. No one's thrilled about it, but at least it won't kill you immediately. Want some meat or cheese? Keep dreaming. That's for Sundays, saints' days, and only if your lord is feeling generous. Most commoners see meat a few times a year, at best. Fresh fruit? Only if it's in season, and not already turned into wine. And spices? Unless you're royalty, forget it. A pinch of pepper can cost more than your monthly wages. Salt? Valuable enough to be locked away like treasure. So you chew your gravel-like bread, gulp your early morning beer, and try not to think about the rat that might have nibbled your stew during the night. Breakfast doesn't give you energy. It happens to you. And now that you're underfed and mildly traumatized, it's time to work, because your life literally depends on it. So, you've had your sad medieval breakfast. Now it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll help much. Your wardrobe consists of one outfit, just one. It's either a rough wool tunic or a linen shift, the same one you've worn for months, maybe years. Seasonal fashion doesn't exist. You wear it until it falls apart or gives you some sort of rash. Underwear, optional. If you're lucky, you might have a linen layer beneath. If not, you're going full medieval commando, under scratchy, sweaty wool, lovingly stitched by someone who had, let's say, a creative idea of what a seam should look like. No washing machine, no soap, no laundromat on the corner. Your clothes are stiff, stained, and smell like a compost pile that spent the week in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to clean them, it's a whole ordeal. You'd need to fetch water from a river or heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic with ashes or lye, and dry it under the sun, which shows up about 3 days a year. Don't even get me started on shoes. If you own any, they're made of raw leather, stitched by hope, and offer about as much arch support as a pancake. Most peasants just go barefoot, through mud, through animal waste, and through what we now call medieval landmines, otherwise known as sharp rocks and disease puddles. All of this means one thing: your skin hates you. You itch constantly. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs live rent-free on your body, and they're not going anywhere. Everyone has them. Nobles, itchy monks, scratchy kids, walking insect sanctuaries. No one escapes. You'll find yourself absent-mindedly scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the village priest. No one reacts. Your skin is raw from constant rubbing. Your scalp? A battlefield of bites. And if you develop a rash, too bad. No doctor, no ointment, no one to gently whisper, "Hey, that might be scabies." You just carry on. And if you don't get an infection, lucky you. That rash will simply join you for the next 6 months, like a clingy medieval sidekick. So now that you're dressed in misery and wrapped in itchy layers of damp wool, it's time to step outside. Time to flash that cheerful morning smile. Except you don't. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling is risky business. Not emotionally, dentally. There's no toothbrush, no paste, no floss, no minty rinse to save the day. Dental hygiene is about as trendy as bathing, which is to say, not at all. Some people might chew on a stick, or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, your teeth are on their own, and they're struggling. By your mid-20s, your smile resembles something rescued from an ancient tomb. Cavities are rampant, gums inflamed, and those aren't food stains. That's rot. There's more decay in your mouth than in the local root cellar. Sugar isn't widespread yet, but it's starting to show up among the wealthy. Imported at ridiculous prices, sprinkled on small cakes, or used as edible status symbols. If you're a noble, congrats. You get to destroy your teeth faster than the poor. If you're a peasant, don't worry, you'll get there. Slowly, with gritty bread, acidic porridge, and years of chewing things that should not be chewed. Toothaches? Get used to them. They're like medieval rain, always lingering, that deep, throbbing pain that makes you consider praying, drinking, or pulling the tooth out yourself. And that wasn't sarcasm. That was the actual solution. There weren't dentists, but there were barber surgeons. Yes, the same person who trims your hair also pulls teeth with iron hooks by candlelight. No anesthesia, just pain, gritted teeth, and maybe a scream or two. If your tooth gets infected, enjoy the fever, because without antibiotics, a simple cavity can turn into sepsis. And yes, a toothache can kill you. Something that today sends you to a pharmacy, back then could send you straight to your grave. And socially, it's no better. Kissing? Good luck. Halitosis, chronic bad breath, is everywhere. If you're single, your dating profile doesn't include teeth. It includes your land, and maybe how many chickens you own. In short, your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing. But hey, enough about oral horrors. Let's head outside, because your real job, the one that will bend your spine and bruise your hands, is about to begin. Time to go to work. No desk, no office, no coffee machine, and absolutely no promotions. If you're like 90% of the population, your job is simple. Stay alive while working for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. Congrats. That means you work land that doesn't belong to you. It belongs to a noble who probably doesn't even know your name. You rise with the sun and stop when it vanishes behind the trees. Your tools? A wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever parts of your body haven't given out yet. There's no weekend, no clock out time, just sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Sunday is off, unless you're harvesting, or fighting off raiders, or praying feverishly for your infected toe to stop turning black. The work is brutal. You plow fields by hand, or with oxen, if you're lucky enough to own one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, weed the crops, carry water, until your spine starts resembling the letter S. No one asks how you're feeling. No one cares. If you're a woman, surprise. You do all that. Plus raise the children, cook, clean, feed the animals, spin wool, and pretend your husband's lice aren't moving into your blanket. And the kids? They start helping by age 5. No toys, no school, just a tiny wooden rake, and the quiet dream of not dying from the next winter flu. If you're not farming, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper. Great. Now you work with fire, or animal guts, or corrosive chemicals all day, in a dark, unventilated shed. Your pay, survival, your perks, occasional bleeding, break a bone, too bad. Catch a fever, drink warm beer and push through. You can't stop. If you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. So, you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career. It's a slow-motion endurance test. And now that your back feels like it's been split in half, let's talk about the weather. Because in medieval times, the weather isn't a topic of small talk. It's a form of punishment from the sky. Let's start with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, no double-pane windows, just wooden walls, with gaps so wide you could pass a chicken through. Your windows are covered with fabric, not glass. And the fire in your hearth? A nice idea. Except you don't have enough firewood to keep it going. Why? Because firewood is expensive, and gathering it from the forest, sometimes illegal. That's right. You could be executed for collecting the wrong stick in the wrong place. So, you wrap yourself in your one damp wool tunic, huddle by the dying embers, and still wake up with your nose frozen solid. Your feet are permanently cold, often wet. Your fingers, stiff little popsicles. Frostbite doesn't get diagnosed. It's just called bad luck. Fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Not even close. Your home now turns into a clay oven. No fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your clothes, but can't take them off, because showing too much skin is scandalous, and also leads to sunburns, bug bites, and judgmental glances from your neighbors. Flies swarm around your unwashed body, drawn by the smell of last week's goat stew still fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ears while you try to sleep, if you can sleep, between the yelling next door and the crying babies. In the fields, the sun bakes you like bread. No sunscreen, no protective hat, unless you manage to twist some straw into a hat-shaped object like a desperate scarecrow. Worst part? You still have to work. Heat stroke? Just called a bad turn. So you're either shivering in your hut, wondering if your toes will make it to spring, or sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs slowly chafe into oblivion. And the one thing that never, ever changes, your clothes still itch, your food still tastes like despair, and your next chore is already waiting. Welcome to climate control, medieval style. There isn't any. Feeling thirsty? Want to freshen up? Maybe splash a little water on your face to wake up from this damp fever dream of a life? Too bad. Because in the Middle Ages, water isn't your friend. It's quietly plotting your downfall. Let's start with drinking. That stream nearby might look fresh, bubbling, clear, like something out of a fantasy book. But it's not. Upstream, someone just emptied a chamber pot into it. Or worse, a pig carcass is slowly decomposing in the current. Every sip is packed with bacteria, parasites, and the full microbial population of 14th century Europe. That's why people drink beer. Yes, even kids. But before you imagine medieval toddlers doing keg stands, let's be clear. It's small beer, weak in alcohol, strong in survival. Brewing it meant boiling the water, which made it safer than whatever was trickling through the town ditch. If you were rich, you might sip wine instead. A great way to stay hydrated, and very unproductive before noon. What about bathing? Surely people used water for that, right? In theory, yes. In practice, not really. Back then, many believed that bathing opened your pores and let disease sneak in. That's right. Cleaning yourself was considered medically risky. So the dirt on your skin, that was protection. A crusty little armor against sickness. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they quickly gained reputations for gossip, mischief, and, let's call it, medieval extracurriculars. Naturally, the church got involved, and many were shut down. Even if you wanted to bathe at home, it was a full production. First, fetch the water from the well, then boil it over a fire, pour it into a leaky wooden tub, and then pray that no one else used it before you, or worse, after you. As for rainwater, it collects in open barrels, where birds poop, insects hatch, and moss thrives. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So whether it's going in your mouth, on your body, or onto your crops. Water in the Middle Ages is less a life source, and more of a daily gamble. One wrong sip, and you're spending your final days curled up in a straw bed, sweating, groaning, and rethinking every decision you've ever made. So the next time you drink tap water, raise a quiet toast to your ancestors. They didn't have hydration, without hazard. So, maybe you drank the water, or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad. Because you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is basically polite torture with a theology degree. Let's begin with the diagnosis. Whether you have a cough, a rash, a broken bone, or something far more ominous, the explanation is always the same. Your humors are unbalanced. According to medieval medicine, your body runs on 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If those aren't perfectly in sync, something bad happens. Think of it like internal soup gone sour. Got a fever? That's too much blood. Solution? Bloodletting. Let's drain your life force into a wooden bowl using a rusty knife or a hungry leech. And yes, the town barber might be the one doing it. Imagine getting a trim and a hemoglobin extraction in one visit. 2 for 1. Feeling down? Anxious? That must be an excess of black bile. The remedy? Laxatives? Or maybe a warm herbal purge? Or just prayer? While everyone quietly starts building your coffin. Break a bone? Deep wound? Oh boy. There's no anesthesia, unless you count passing out from the pain. Surgery tools haven't been washed since the Crusades. Instruments heated over fire, not for cleanliness, just for dramatic effect. Germs? Never heard of them. The belief is that sickness comes from bad air, or divine punishment. Stomachache? Must be your sinful thoughts. Time to confess while vomiting. If your symptoms get worse, expect more leeches, crushed beetles, and maybe a priest at your bedside, just in case it's time for last rites. At this point, they're prepping for the ultimate cure, death. And if, by some miracle, you recover, everyone assumes it was divine mercy. The doctor takes full credit, and the leech gets promoted. So yes, in medieval times, medicine isn't about healing. It's about surviving the treatment. After a long day of fieldwork, fleas, and bloodletting, it's finally time for dinner. You limp back to your hut, stomach growling, craving the one remaining joy in life, a warm meal. Bad news, your meal is probably trying to kill you. Let's begin with the basics. Food preservation? Not really a thing. No fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or the naive hope that the cold night air keeps things fresh. If you've managed to score some meat, it's likely been hanging for days, covered in flies, soaked in mysterious brine, and shared with at least one rat. Bread, the cornerstone of your medieval diet. Even that isn't safe. In bad harvests, peasants get creative. Bark, sawdust, clay, all mixed in to make it last longer. And if it's rye season, you get a little bonus, ergot, a fun fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating toast laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables? Only if they're in season. And you know what's always in season? Turnips, boiled, mashed, floating in pottage. Turnips in all forms. Forever. And pottage, if you recall, is basically a bubbling stew of mystery, simmering for weeks, possibly since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might appear in the fall, but it rots quickly. Sugar, rare, expensive, and hoarded by the rich to show off their blackened teeth. Dairy, a gamble. Fresh milk spoils fast. Butter and cheese do better, but they're still packed with bacteria. People eat them anyway, because otherwise, it's back to chewing shoe leather. And seasoning? Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg, worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, a pinch of salt, if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap, sprinkled with disappointment. But food in the Middle Ages isn't just a health risk, It's political. Game animals, rabbits, deer, birds, don't belong to you. They belong to the local lord. Get caught snaring a rabbit in the woods? You could be fined, imprisoned, or hanged. That's right. Your dinner could get you executed. So, as you sit by dim firelight, spooning gray stew into your mouth, just remember, every bite is a calculated risk, but you eat it anyway. Because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish, it tests you. Evening falls. You've labored, suffered, and just barely survived that sketchy stew. You might think the day is done, but don't get too cozy, because God is watching. And so is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely report you if you miss Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't a part of life, it is life. The church controls everything: your calendar, your laws, your marriage, your education, if you can read, your birth, your death, and everything in between. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Daily life is structured around bells. The church bell rings in the morning, noon, and evening, not to remind you of time, but to remind you prayer is non-negotiable. Forget to bow, sin, eat meat on a Friday, sin, dream vaguely about your neighbor's wife, double sin, and hell, very real, extremely detailed. Priests describe it with flair, rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. If the plague doesn't scare you, eternal damnation will. You can't read the Bible yourself. It's written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, priests, and that one noble kid who's never touched a shovel. So, you rely on the church to interpret everything. If the priest says your crops failed because you didn't kneel hard enough, well, better get back on your knees. Tithes, mandatory. You give 1/10 of whatever you produce. Grow wheat, give wheat, raise chickens, hand over eggs, own nothing? Congratulations. You're spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. Holy days, plenty of them. But they're not for celebration. They're for fasting, confessing, and remembering that joy is highly suspicious. Question the church? Dangerous territory. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers get whipped, skeptics get corrected, with force. So you go through the motions, you chant, you bow, you pray, and you hope that after this dirt-covered life, your soul gets a seat in paradise, assuming the priest approves. Because in the Middle Ages, God might be merciful, but the church, not so much. And if you thought being a medieval man was brutal, try doing all of that as a woman. Same filth, same famine, same fear, plus childbirth, subservience, and near total invisibility. Being a woman in the Middle Ages is like playing on hard mode with no health potions and no restart button. From the moment she's born, a girl's path is mostly set. Marry young, have children, serve your husband, die exhausted. Education? Unlikely. Unless you're noble and shipped off to a convent, your schooling ends around the time you learn to churn butter and patch holes in a tunic. Marriage happens early, really early. Being betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14 isn't odd, it's expected. And love? Irrelevant. Marriages are about land, livestock, and family alliances. Your opinion is not required. Once married, you belong to your husband. Your job, bear children, feed everyone, manage the home, and don't complain. Because if you do, you might be labeled a nag, or worse, a witch. That label comes with a free execution. Fire or water, dealer's choice. Childbirth, a gamble. There's no prenatal care, no clean tools, no pain relief. Midwives do what they can, but even minor problems can be deadly for mother, child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies, Others don't make it past 2. But don't relax yet, because once the baby arrives, your workload only increases. Now, you're nursing a newborn in a hut full of lice, while also expected to cook, clean, care for everyone, and still help in the fields. There's no break. Not today. Not tomorrow. You are the break for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, vulnerable. If you speak your mind, dangerous. Women who didn't conform were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they knew about herbs, had a strong personality, or made eye contact on a rainy Tuesday. Even in the church, your role is limited. Nuns live under strict rules, no speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual value, always ranked below men. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, your mission is to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, preferably while smiling. Because even in a time of universal misery, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully. So far you've battled filth, famine, injustice, and maybe a goat. And just when you think it can't get worse, here comes violence, loud, bloody, and widely accepted. Let's be honest, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. Law and order mostly meant, hope the local lord isn't in a bad mood. Violence is everywhere, in homes, in streets, on the battlefield, even in disputes at the town bakery. Crime is common, punishment is brutal, and justice? More of a show than a system. Steal a loaf of bread, lose a hand. Caught lying, your tongue might get pierced. Gossip too much, meet the scold's bridle, a metal cage strapped to your head with a bar across your tongue. For correction, of course. Accused of something serious? Heresy, theft, witchcraft. Time to prove your innocence through trial by ordeal. One version. Stick your hand in boiling water to grab a stone. If your hand heals in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, guilty. Another version. Get tossed into a river. Sink, innocent, and probably dead. Float, guilty, and punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where survival is the prize and the host wants you to lose. And if you're sentenced to die, that's a public event. Executions were entertainment. Hangings, burnings, beheadings. Spectators brought snacks. The medieval version of cable TV. Domestic violence, considered normal. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to discipline their wives and kids. Street fights, commonplace. You could get beaten just for looking sideways at a noble's horse. And war, always brewing. Local feuds, land disputes, crusades. Someone was always marching off to stab someone else for honor, God, or boredom. Violence isn't a breakdown of medieval society. It is society. Everyone lives with the constant knowledge that life is fragile, justice is random, and your neighbor might bash your head in over a pig. So walk carefully, keep your eyes low, and never trust anyone carrying a club. At this point, you've made it through lice, leeches, laundryless suffering, and the looming risk of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives. Death. Not noble, not glorious, not delayed. If you're still breathing after 40, you're basically a celebrity. They might even call you the Old One, which is less a nickname and more a statistical miracle. Let's break it down. The average life expectancy? Around 30 to 40 years. But that number is heavily skewed by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before reaching age 5. One infection. One bad winter. That's all it took. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you made it through childhood, you entered adulthood already worn down. Work began as soon as you could walk. By 25, Your joints crackled like an old chapel door. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your optimism. Women faced a particularly cruel challenge: childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for women. No prenatal care, no sterile tools, no painkillers, just hot water, whispered prayers, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a pile of straw. For men, the threats were different, but just as relentless. Farming accidents, infections from small cuts, fights with drunk neighbors, a crusade gone sideways. Even walking to the market could get you ambushed by a bored bandit or hassled by an angry tax collector. And then there were the silent killers, plague, turning cities into graveyards overnight. Famine, lasting entire seasons, thinning out whole villages. Or maybe you died from something simpler, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and yelling at the walls. As for funerals, you were lucky if you got one. Most bodies were buried quickly to prevent disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a shallow hole, a few whispered prayers, and a thin layer of dirt, if there was still space left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval Europe, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death in all its creative forms. You didn't retire, you just stopped showing up. And speaking of exits, let's wrap up your final chapter. How's your day been? You woke up in filth, relieved yourself into a bucket, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, skipped breakfast because there wasn't any, worked until your spine filed a complaint, scratched your way through itchy wool, prayed not to catch the plague, and nearly got executed for owning a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a knight? Think again. That shiny, romantic version of the Middle Ages, the noble knights, the ladies in towers, the epic feasts beneath chandeliers of flickering candlelight. It's a myth, a fantasy, polished by fairy tales and heavily sanitized history books. The real medieval world was harsh, unfair, relentless. Hierarchy ruled everything. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born rich, congrats. You had a better chance of surviving, but you were still one bowl of bad stew away from dysentery and a hasty grave. Even the nobility weren't safe from misery. Castles were drafty stone boxes filled with fleas, smoke, and awkward political marriages. Sure, you had a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in a sword fight or from an infected splinter. Simpler times weren't simple. They were survival on hard mode. Everything took longer, everything hurt more, even basic things like childbirth or chewing. And if you found a quiet moment to dream, there wasn't much to do with it. No mobility, no medicine, no internet to search. What is this weird rash? You lived, you suffered, and you died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. But here's the wildest part. Through all of it, people still laughed. They sang songs. They fell in love. They told stories by firelight. They made meaning out of misery. Not because life was easy, but because humans are stubborn like that. Even in the darkest chapters, we carve out space for light. So tonight, as you lie in a warm bed, surrounded by walls that don't leak, with plumbing, antibiotics, and a fridge full of snacks, maybe whisper a quiet thank you to the modern world, and to the people who came before you, who fought off rats, famine, and feudalism, so you wouldn't have to. Long before she became Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, mistress of reform, and icon of ambition, she was simply Sophie. Born Sophie Friederike Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst in the year 1729. The daughter of a relatively obscure German princely family, her tiny duchy in Pomerania offered little in terms of power. But Sophie herself had something no title could grant: razor-sharp intelligence, relentless charm, and a quiet hunger for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was ambitious and cold, more concerned with climbing the social ladder than comforting her daughter. Her father, a Prussian officer, was distant, formal, and largely absent. From a young age, Sophie learned to walk the tightrope between obedience and strategy. She read everything, spoke multiple languages, and mastered the art of reading a room before speaking a word, skills that would soon become her greatest survival tools. When Empress Elizabeth of Russia began searching for a bride for her heir, Grand Duke Peter, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Peter was of German descent, and Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, grateful, modest, and easy to control, would be the perfect fit. Sophie checked every box: noble blood, Lutheran background, which she'd be required to abandon, and a reputation for both humility and poise. At just 14 years old, Sophie was summoned to Russia. She arrived in the freezing capital of St. Petersburg in the winter of 1744, wrapped in thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her name was Sophie, and her mother, ever the strategist, pushed her forward like a chess piece. But Sophie had her own game in mind. To become acceptable in Russian society, she converted to orthodoxy, publicly, symbolically, completely. She took a new name, Ekaterina Alexeyevna, or as history would remember her, Catherine. It wasn't just a change of religion, it was the burning of a bridge, a step into a foreign empire with no return ticket. No one watching that quiet teenage girl in a fur-trimmed coat could have predicted what would come next. Betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, empire. From the moment Sophie stepped into the Russian court, she stopped being a pawn and began planning how to become a queen. Her marriage to Grand Duke Peter was supposed to secure her place in the Romanov dynasty. But from the start, it felt more like a cage than a crown. Peter, heir to the Russian throne, was no fairy tale prince. Awkward, immature, obsessively attached to toy soldiers. He preferred playing war games in his chambers over ruling a nation, or acknowledging his wife. Some accounts claim he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He idolized Frederick of Prussia and resented the Russian court that had adopted him. Catherine, in contrast, embraced her new home. She studied the language, memorized its history, learned Orthodox customs with unwavering focus. She wanted to belong. He wanted to disappear. And that mismatch wasn't just personal, it was political. The Russian court was a nest of whispers, paranoia, power plays. Every glance held weight. Every rumor could kill. Empress Elizabeth still ruled, but her health was failing. Everyone sensed a shift was coming. Everyone had an agenda. Catherine was watched constantly. Her letters read, her friendships questioned. Even her servants were told to listen more than serve. She couldn't trust her husband, or her mother, or the walls around her. But Catherine was no fool. She played the court's game with quiet precision. She built relationships, earned the favor of generals, spoke with scholars, projected calm while her husband threw tantrums in public. Behind closed doors, she read Voltaire, Montesquieu, and other voices of the Enlightenment. While others saw a nervous consort, Catherine was building a vision, not just for herself, but for an empire. A nation of strength, education, and reason. But there was one problem. As long as Peter lived, Catherine remained in limbo, a wife without power, tied to a throne she could never touch. So she waited, she observed, and she planned. She knew the Russian crown wouldn't be inherited, it would have to be taken. In 1762, nearly 2 decades after arriving in Russia, Catherine saw her moment. Empress Elizabeth had died. Peter, now Peter III, ascended to the throne, and immediately began unraveling his own reign. In just months, he alienated the clergy, mocked the nobility, and insulted the army. He lavished praise on Prussia, Russia's sworn rival, undid key reforms, threatened divorce, and made clear he planned to replace Catherine with his mistress. The court cooled, the generals whispered, and the people watched their new czar with unease. Catherine, always listening, always calculating, made her move. In July of that same year, while Peter was away at his summer palace, she struck. It was a bloodless coup, backed by high-ranking officers, including her lover, Grigory Orlov, and his powerful brothers. Catherine rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia. She was proclaimed Empress Catherine II and won the loyalty of the feared Imperial Guard. Peter, caught off guard and isolated, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody, and shortly after, found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, a sudden illness. Unofficially, assassination. And just like that, Catherine was empress, not by blood, not by marriage, but by will, wit, and sheer audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman, with no royal bloodline, had taken the Russian throne without firing a single shot. But the true challenge was just beginning. She had to turn that daring seizure of power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without sharing her husband's fate? Catherine understood something vital. Power gained through intrigue could just as easily be lost. To rule, she would need to stop being a conspirator and become a visionary. And so began her transformation, from cautious tactician to reforming empress. One who would redraw borders, embrace philosophy, and redefine what it meant to be a woman in command. With the crown in hand, Catherine could have rested. She didn't. Her ambition was larger than any throne. She didn't just want to rule Russia, she wanted to rebuild it, not just with armies or decrees, but with ideas. While Peter played with toy soldiers and idolized Frederick of Prussia, Catherine immersed herself in the ideas of Voltaire, Diderot, and the great thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, in progress, in the monarch's duty to serve the people, even as she ruled them with absolute power. Catherine didn't just read philosophy, she lived it. She corresponded with Voltaire for over 15 years, charming him, flattering him, and defending her rule with elegant logic. She invited Diderot to her court and bought his entire library just to support him financially. Behind palace doors, she devoured legal texts, debated reforms, and mapped policies to modernize a medieval empire. In 1767, she formed the Legislative Commission, an ambitious attempt to rewrite all of Russian law. Her nakaz, or instruction, became a political manifesto in disguise. It argued for legal equality, condemned torture, and reimagined rulership as a service to the common good. For 18th century Russia, this was revolutionary. But ideals don't always survive contact with reality. Russia was still feudal, still deeply conservative, and ruled by nobles who liked their serfs exactly where they were, beneath them. Catherine understood this. She moved carefully. She limited torture. She expanded secular education, She built schools, founded libraries, and opened intellectual spaces. But to keep the nobility loyal, she also protected their rights to control the peasants beneath them. This was her balancing act. Philosopher queen in public, political realist in private. She walked a tightrope between Paris salons and Moscow backrooms, between Enlightenment ideals and Russian survival. In many ways, Catherine wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make it modern, on her own terms. That meant reform, but with an iron hand wrapped in a velvet glove. But Catherine didn't stop at internal change. She looked outward. She wanted to expand Russia, not just its borders, but its presence on the world stage. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Catherine aimed to knock down the walls. Under her leadership, Russia became larger than it had ever been. She waged wars not only to defend her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These conflicts, waged in waves through the 1760s and 70s, were about more than land. They were about influence. Catherine saw herself as the protector of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule, and as the rightful guardian of Eastern Europe. Under generals like Suvorov and Potemkin, Russia captured Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and precious warm-water ports long sought by Russian rulers. These victories weren't just strategic, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Catherine sent a message. Russia was no longer Europe's strange, backward cousin. Russia was no longer just present on the map. It was a continental force, and Catherine wasn't done. She turned her gaze westward. Through a mix of deals, diplomacy, and quiet force, she took part in the partitions of Poland, alongside Austria and Prussia. By 1795, after the third and final partition, Poland disappeared from the map. Russia gained vast new territories and millions of new subjects. But Catherine didn't conquer only with armies. She colonized with ideas. New cities were founded. Trade routes expanded. German settlers were invited to cultivate distant farmlands. The Russian Empire became a mosaic, from the icy shores of the Baltic to the sunlit coast of the Black Sea. And through it all, Catherine remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, personally overseeing the shape of her empire. Critics would call her imperialistic, power-hungry. But to Catherine, expansion wasn't ambition, it was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by their ideas, but by their borders. Catherine didn't just want to rule Russia, she wanted to remake it as a cultured, strategic, and undeniably powerful empire, loyal to her, and her alone. But for all her reforms and military victories, Catherine was just as well known for what happened behind palace doors. And not all of it took place in libraries. Catherine had lovers. Not one, not two. A carefully curated sequence of companions. Many were decades younger, handsome, and often politically useful. She didn't hide them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, land, and pensions, if they behaved. If not, they were dismissed, sometimes with a thank you letter and a quiet promotion. Among her most important lovers was Grigory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between love, strategy, and empire building. Some historians believe they may have secretly married. Together, they shaped Russia's military campaigns, southern expansion, and colonization efforts. Potemkin wasn't just a lover, he was her partner in power. Still, Europe couldn't look away from the scandal. Gossip followed her everywhere. Pamphlets painted her as lustful, insatiable, even unhinged. And after her death, The rumors got worse. The most infamous? A grotesque and false tale involving a horse, invented purely to smear her legacy. But why the obsession? Simple. Catherine was a woman who held power without apology, in a world that expected female rulers to be saintly or tragic. She was neither. She lived, she loved, and she ruled on her own terms. That made her dangerous. Ironically, while her critics painted her as immoral, Catherine was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed pleasure was part of life, not in conflict with leadership. She separated emotion from governance, a balance few male rulers ever managed. In truth, her liaisons were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and useful to the crown, and when they no longer were, she let them go. Politely, generously. Her love life didn't weaken her rule. It was part of her political calculus, a blend of passion and power that made her unforgettable, and sometimes unstoppable. But even Catherine's reign wasn't without danger. In 1773, that danger arrived in the form of a bearded Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev. He wasn't your typical rebel. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III, Catherine's dead husband. According to him, he had survived the coup and returned to reclaim his crown from the foreign impostor. It was absurd. Peter was long dead. But to Russia's poor, exhausted, and oppressed lower classes, truth wasn't required. Sometimes, hope is enough. That's all Pugachev needed to ignite a fire. He promised freedom from serfdom, lower taxes, and land for the common people. His words swept across the Volga River region like sparks in a drought. Among Cossacks, peasants, and old believers, his rebellion felt like salvation. It quickly became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns fell, fortresses collapsed, nobles were slaughtered. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked as if the empire might fracture. Catherine was shaken. This wasn't a foreign threat. It was a revolt, from within. But she didn't panic. She acted. Professional troops were dispatched to crush the rebellion, ruthlessly. In 1774, Pugachev's forces were defeated. He was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and beheaded in Moscow, a very public warning. After that, Catherine doubled down on control and surveillance. Her dream of liberating the serfs quietly disappeared. The rebellion had shown her the limits of enlightenment in a nation still shackled by feudal chains. She now leaned harder on the nobility, offering loyalty in exchange for total control over their serfs. It was a turning point. The empress who once quoted Voltaire now prioritized order over idealism. Reform became cautious. Whispers of rebellion were stomped out before they could breathe. Pugachev lost his head, but left behind a warning. Power built on inequality cannot hold forever. By the time Catherine the Great reached the final chapter of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 30 years, longer than any woman in its history. From the moment she took the crown, she defied every expectation. She reshaped an empire and redefined what it meant to be a woman and a ruler. Under her reign, Russia expanded by over 200,000 square miles, including Crimea, large parts of Poland, and the Black Sea coast. But these were more than conquests. They were strategic shifts that secured warm water ports, reshaped trade routes, and reoriented Russia's place on the continent. Yet her impact wasn't only drawn on maps. Catherine founded the Hermitage Museum, amassing one of Europe's greatest art collections. She corresponded with the minds of her time, thinkers, reformers, philosophers. Her court became a beacon of sophistication and culture. In a nation often dismissed as backward, Catherine placed Russia firmly on the cultural map. She modernized education, including schools for girls, promoted book printing, introduced smallpox inoculation, even receiving it herself in public. A bold move in her time. Yet her reign was not without contradiction. She admired Enlightenment ideals, but never freed the serfs. In fact, she expanded serfdom into new territories. Her reforms were brilliant, but top-down, designed to polish the empire more than transform its foundation. Still, Catherine brought stability and ambition to a vast, complex land. She understood that power was not a birthright. It was crafted, managed, and defended every day. She ruled not by divine right, but by strategy, vision, and will. History has called her many things: a manipulator, a tyrant, a reformer, a seductress. But above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was larger, wealthier, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a secure throne, an expanded empire, and a legacy that would stretch far beyond her lifetime. Catherine didn't just reign. She ruled with intellect, strategy, and unapologetic force. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. For all her victories, her letters, and her maps carved into history, Catherine the Great remained, at her core, a woman navigating a world never meant for her. She wasn't born Russian. She seized the crown in a coup. She ruled an empire that never truly welcomed a woman in charge. And yet, she didn't just survive. She thrived. Catherine was never content to be ornamental. She read constantly, wrote endlessly, governed ferociously. Her daily life was relentless. Hours spent reading reports, answering foreign envoys, editing state papers, and managing a court filled with whispers and ambition. She didn't just sit on the throne. She worked it, like someone born to power. And yet, for all her confidence, she was often alone, surrounded by lovers, artists, and courtiers, but writing in her memoirs how few people she could truly trust. Her son, Paul, the one she distrusted and kept away from power, had grown into a man she feared, not for his strength, but for his ability to undo everything she had built. Her deepest bond with Grigory Potemkin faded into quiet friendship, and when he died in 1791, he left behind a silence that never fully healed. Catherine understood image. She crafted hers carefully. She posed as the mother of Russia, the enlightened monarch, the warrior empress, and patron of the arts. But behind every crown and canvas was a woman who had endured betrayal, rejection, rebellion, and kept going. When she died in 1796, she left behind a transformed empire and lingering questions. Could she have ended serfdom? Were her ideals compromised by political necessity? Was she a reformer, or simply a ruler? History remembers her by a title she never gave herself: the Great. Not because she was flawless, or kind, or just, but because she took power and wielded it on her own terms in a time when women weren't supposed to hold any. Catherine didn't just wear the crown, she rewrote what it meant to deserve one. But now, we journey elsewhere. Deep in the humid jungles of Chiapas, southern Mexico, ancient ruins rise like stone ghosts from the forest floor. This is Palenque, once a great Maya city. Its temples and towers still whisper stories of kings, priests, and forgotten dynasties. In 1994, one of those whispers became a voice. A team of Mexican archaeologists, led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez, was surveying Temple 13, a modest pyramid standing quietly beside the more famous Temple of the Inscriptions. That temple held the tomb of the mighty Pakal the Great. Temple 13? It was thought to be unremarkable, until they found a sealed chamber beneath it, unlooted, untouched, pristine. When the team broke through and lowered themselves inside, they found a stone sarcophagus resting in eerie silence. The air was heavy with the weight of centuries. As they opened the lid, a crimson cloud rose into the air, a shocking, vibrant red. The body had been buried in powdered cinnabar, toxic mercury sulfide used ceremonially by the Maya. And lying within that cloud was the skeleton of a woman, fragile, intact, still wearing a jade mask. Around her, necklaces, ear spools, diadems, all carved from jade and shell. Everything about the burial screamed royalty, yet there was no name, no glyph, no inscription to identify her. It was one of the richest female tombs ever found in Mesoamerica, and no one knew who she was. The archaeologists gave her a name, La Reina Roja, the Red Queen. Even with modern forensics, her identity remains a mystery. Was she a queen? A priestess? Pakal's wife? No one can say for sure, but her burial was unlike anything else. Her tomb wasn't just ceremonial, it was spiritual. She was meant to be remembered, not with names, but with ritual, with color, and with the mystery she left behind. The most haunting part? The red dust. Cinnabar coated everything. The sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, even the jade offerings. It clung to stone like blood to memory. For the Maya, red was sacred, the color of sunrise, of sacrifice, of life reborn from death. Cinnabar wasn't decoration, it was transformation. In Maya belief, death wasn't the end. It was a passage into another cosmic layer. And this woman, whoever she was, wasn't being buried. She was being prepared for deification. But there's another layer, one that modern science can't ignore. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure leads to mercury poisoning, tremors, hallucinations, even death. The Maya didn't know the chemistry, but they felt the power. It was volatile, potent, dangerous. To bathe a body in it was to declare this was no mortal. In all of Palenque, only a few were buried with cinnabar. One of them was Pakal the Great. The other was her. That one detail, the cinnabar, drew immediate speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal divine standing? Her skull rested on a layer of jaguar skin, another sacred symbol tied to royalty and the underworld. Around her lay bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines, hints of rituals performed either in life or in her honor at death. Every object in her tomb told a story, without words, a story of power, cloaked in secrecy. A woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony, drenched in the color of sacrifice. Surrounding her crimson-covered remains was a world of silence, broken only by the gleam of jade, shell, and polished obsidian. These were not decorations. They were offerings, hand-picked to guide her spirit through the Maya afterlife. Xibalba. At her sides lay jade necklaces, heavy and cold, their surface still radiant after centuries underground. Jade wasn't just beautiful, it was sacred. To the Maya, jade represented eternal life, the green of maize, the breath of the jungle, the soul of the gods. Only the elite were buried with jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, her wrists, her ears, a clear sign that in life, she had held power, perhaps even divine favor. One of the most haunting objects was the jade death mask placed delicately over her face. Not golden like Egypt's pharaohs, but mosaic. Dozens of tiny jade tiles, cut and fitted to mimic the shape of her skull. The mask had a purpose: to preserve identity, to protect the soul, and to present her as divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and carved shells. Tools of ritual? Symbols of status? Likely both. One bone pin bore a faint inscription, not quite a name, but a trace of her voice, whispering across time. Along the edges of the tomb were ceramic vessels, still sealed, once filled perhaps with food, drink, or incense. Not luxuries, provisions for the journey beyond death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a path, layered, perilous, filled with challenges. This wasn't a burial, it was a departure. And the tomb itself felt intimate, not lavish, intentional, no gold, no chariots, just artifacts chosen with meaning, a map for the soul. Through these objects we glimpse how the Maya understood death, not as finality, but as transformation. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. But for all the richness, one detail lingered, one absence, no name, no glyphs, no inscription on the walls. She was clearly someone extraordinary. But who? Scholars have been trying to connect the pieces ever since. The most compelling theory: she was Tsakbu Ajao, the noble wife of Kinich Janab Pakal, known to us as Pakal the Great. Tsakbu wasn't just a consort. She was born into royalty, married young, bore royal sons, and stood alongside her husband in public ceremony. If any woman deserved a burial of this magnitude, it was her. Supporting this theory was the location. Her tomb lies just steps away from Pakal's own burial in the Temple of the Inscriptions. A deliberate pairing, perhaps, husband and wife, rulers even in death. Then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Palanque have been found with this much red powder. One was Pakal, the other, the Red Queen. Surely not a coincidence. And yet, the mystery remains. DNA tests were run. The results, inconclusive. Her bones showed no maternal link to Pakal, but that didn't rule out a spousal connection. So we are left where the Maya wanted us, with awe, with reverence, and with questions. She was powerful, she was sacred, and she was meant to be remembered, not by name, but by color. Red. After all, marriage does not require shared blood. Some have proposed that the Red Queen was Sakkuk, Pakal's powerful mother, who ruled Palanque before he came of age. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor, her name lost to the long erosion of memory. But the evidence points most clearly to Tsakbu Ajao, queen by title, mother of kings, and spiritual counterpart to Pakal. And the absence of her name? Perhaps not an oversight. Perhaps intentional. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on not through monuments, but through ritual, symbol, and the whispers of the earth. And so, the Red Queen remains suspended between legend and truth. A woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from. A world where Maya women, especially royal ones, held far more influence than many ever imagined. In Maya civilization, politics was family. Royal women weren't just decorative consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, power brokers. They conducted rituals, sponsored temples, and secured dynasties through bloodline and ceremony. Their names were etched in glyphs, their words carved in stone, until they weren't. Take Sakkuk, the mother of Pakal the Great. When the throne of Palanque was left vacant, she ruled in her own name until her son came of age. She wasn't a placeholder. She was a ruler, issuing decrees, overseeing construction, guiding her city through uncertainty. And she was not alone. Across the Maya world, from Yaxchilan to Naranjo, from Calakmul to Copan, inscriptions tell of women who conducted ceremonies, forged alliances, and sometimes ruled outright. They stood in murals wearing headdresses, jade regalia, and the authority of the divine. They stood beside kings, and sometimes above them. But when the Spanish arrived centuries later, that memory faded. A colonial lens cast Maya women as silent, passive. But archaeology tells a different story. A story of negotiated power, of women who weren't just permitted to exist, but were essential to the spiritual and political fabric of Maya life. And that reframes the Red Queen entirely. She may not have ruled in name, but her burial says she was central to Palenque's royal order. Her jade mask was not just decoration, it was identity, power held in life and protected in death. Her bloodline may have been the thread that held the dynasty together. In Maya belief, a queen wasn't just a wife. She was a keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in ritual, a bridge between the human and the divine. The Red Queen may be nameless, but in her time, she was never voiceless. She wasn't just buried with treasure, she was buried in architecture, a structure layered with cosmology, myth, and sacred geometry. Her tomb was no grave, it was a gateway to eternity. She was found inside Temple 13, a modest pyramid hidden in the heart of Palenque. But its location, just steps away from Pakal's grand resting place, speaks volumes. Maya temples weren't placed randomly. They were aligned with the stars, dynastic cycles, and divine purpose. Temple 13 rises humbly next to the Temple of the Inscriptions, but it hides something more intimate, a crypt, untouched for over 1,300 years, hidden deep within the stone, accessed only by a steep, narrow descent. The journey downward felt almost symbolic, a passage into the underworld. The chamber itself is stark, no murals, no glyphs, just silence. And perhaps that silence is the message. This was not a place for the living to interpret. This was a space for the dead to transform. At its center, her sarcophagus sat like an altar, carved from limestone. It echoed the great stone coffin of Pakal the Great, just next door. But where Pakal's lid is engraved with grand cosmic rebirth, the Red Queen's tomb is quieter. The focus is inward, on the body, the cinnabar, the ritual of death itself. And yet, there are architectural whispers. The tomb is aligned east to west, mirroring the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber is small, but it doesn't feel small. It feels deliberate, personal, a sacred enclosure for someone revered. Maya temples weren't just buildings. They were cosmological tools, bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be buried in one was to be elevated beyond mortality. The Red Queen's eternal home wasn't an afterthought. It was a shrine, a place where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her essence in cinnabar, her legacy in architecture. A temple that speaks without words, telling us she mattered. To the Maya, death was not an end, but a threshold, a sacred crossing into Xibalba, the Maya underworld. And for someone like the Red Queen, this passage was not just spiritual, it was political, cosmological, ritualized. Maya burial rites were choreographed, based in myth, designed to guide the soul through darkness, trials, and divine judgment. Xibalba was not peace. It was a labyrinth, a place of rivers, blood, gods of death. Only those properly buried, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped, could complete the journey. The Red Queen was encased in stone, wrapped in cinnabar, surrounded by offerings. It was an elite burial. And yet, there was more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades may point to rituals of auto-sacrifice. These weren't just tools. They were symbols of rites she performed in life, or that were reenacted at her death. Her jade mask, composed of tiny mosaic tiles, wasn't ornamental. It was a vessel, a spiritual medium preserving her identity for the gods. The Maya believed the face was the mirror of the soul, and that the soul had to be recognized. The ceramic vessels surrounding her may have once held cacao, maize, water, or pulque, nourishment for the next world. Other objects, like stingray spines or shell trumpets, may have been tools of ritual communication, ways to call the gods. For the Maya, burial wasn't goodbye. It was a planting, death as seed, afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were more than rulers. They were seen as divine beings made flesh, and in death, they returned to the sacred order of the cosmos. The Red Queen, bathed in blood-colored dust, encased in a temple, honored with jade, wasn't buried as a mortal. She was prepared for rebirth. Just steps from her resting place lies one of the most iconic tombs in all Mesoamerica, that of Kainich Janab Pakal, known simply as Pakal the Great. His burial, inside the grand temple of the inscriptions, is legendary for its scale, its artistry, and its cosmic symbolism. But the Red Queen's tomb? What makes it extraordinary is not just what was inside, it's where it was found. Her sarcophagus lay within Temple 13, a modest pyramid right beside Pakal's monumental temple. In Palenque, nothing was placed randomly. Temples followed astronomy, myth, and dynastic intention. The closeness of their tombs was not chance. It was a statement, a bond carved in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Tzakbu Ajao, Pakal's queen, consort, and spiritual counterpart. Though her tomb carries no name, the mirrored rituals are striking. Both bathed in cinnabar, both entombed in pyramids, both honored with jade. Their deaths echo one another, like two halves of a sacred narrative. On Pakal's lid, we see him descending into the world tree, returning to the underworld in a cosmic rebirth. And just beside him, silent, shrouded, but radiant in red, is her. The Red Queen's tomb lacked engraved iconography, but the symbolism was never missing. If Pakal represented the sun, journeying through the underworld to rise again each morning, then the Red Queen may have embodied the moon, the feminine force, silent, mysterious, following her own path across the sky. Together, they formed a cosmic duality, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual, masculine and feminine, not opposites, but balance. In Maya mythology, rulership wasn't singular, it was relational. Harmony in the cosmos depended on the harmony between rulers. By placing the Red Queen beside Pakal, the Maya weren't just honoring a marriage, they were preserving a partnership, a sacred balance made eternal in stone. She wasn't behind him, she was beside him, in life and in death. Together, they speak without words, two souls, wrapped in cinnabar and silence, joined across eternity. Though her name was lost, the Red Queen endures, not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most enigmatic and powerful women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 1,300 years, whispers across time, inviting questions and resisting answers. We may never know her name. No glyph recorded her story, no stela bore her voice. And yet, the care in her burial, the depth of her offerings, and the color that cloaked her bones all say one thing clearly: she mattered. Not simply as a wife or consort, but as a woman of influence, of spiritual weight, of dynastic power. The Red Queen forces us to rethink assumptions. In the ancient Maya world, women weren't background figures. They led rituals, governed cities, anchored bloodlines, and shaped dynasties. While kings like Pakal took the spotlight for centuries, the Red Queen's return reminds us that power never belonged to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy isn't just jade and stone, it's the conversation she's reignited. Every layer of cinnabar, every architectural decision, speaks of a life that changed the course of a kingdom. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of her story is not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen reminds us, history is not a collection of cold facts. It is a living puzzle. A shared human longing to connect across centuries. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the color of blood, of rebirth, of sacrifice and sunrise. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now looks back at us through science, through art, through wonder. She remains nameless, but not voiceless, mysterious, but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death she rules something greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone, her story was written in silence, and still, somehow, she speaks.